The Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro. I can't say I really want to talk about Jair Bolsonaro, but I kind of have to. You see, his recent rise to power was so unprecedented, so unanticipated, and so deeply shocking to so much of the world that we can't possibly ignore it. I mean, here's a guy who, for the last 30 years, has made a political career for himself as a kind of poop-throwing clown, always attracting just enough attention to retain his seat in Parliament, but for the same reason permanently relegating himself to the back seat of real national power. That is until October 2018, when against all expectations in Brazil and abroad, he somehow got himself elected to Latin America's most populous country. Now, I know you can't really know somebody by their idiosyncratic tripe that they periodically spill from their mouth. But you know, words do have a lot of meaning, and well, to give you an idea, here's an extremely short list of some of the more inane things that Jair Bolsonaro has said publicly over the years.
Eu sou favorável à tortura, tu sabe disso.
Nós não, o povo, a sociedade brasileira não gosta de homossexual. A cultura é diferente da nossa. Agora, nós não estamos preparados ainda, no Brasil, porque nem um pai, nem você, nem eu, tem orgulho de ter um filho gay. Orgulho, prazer, fazer festa, porque apareceu um filho gay na família.
If the child is happy.
Isso, porque o filho começa a ficar meio assim, meio gayzinho, leva um couro, ele muda o comportamento dele. Tá certo?
Se seu filho se apaixonasse por uma negra, o que você faria?
Ô, Preta, eu não vou discutir promiscuidade com quem quer que seja. Eu corro esse risco que meus filhos foram muito bem educados.
Eu fui num quilombola em Eldorado Paulista. O afrodescendente mais leve lá pesava 7 arrobas. Não fazem nada. Eu acho que nem para procriadores serve mais.
Jamais isso pra você que você não merece.
Olha, eu espero que não.
Dá, eu te dou outra. Dá que 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 eu te dou outra.
Mas o que é isso?
Você me chamou de estuprador? Você me chamou de estuprador? Você é uma imoral. Tá, vagabunda?
Mas o que é isso? O que é isso aqui?
I don't know, maybe I'm alone in my thinking here, but when I hear a politician speaking in such a way publicly and vociferously, well, usually my first reaction isn't to say, hey, we should elect this guy as our president. Nevertheless, in 2018, tens of thousands of Brazilians did think he would be a great president, and well, they voted for him in droves. Why? How could they like such a guy? So what really explains the rise of Jair Bolsonaro? Well, we'll get to this in a moment, but first, a word from our sponsors. Okay. So what explains the rise of Jair Bolsonaro? We in the field of political science are still trying to make sense of all of this, but there are, to be sure, some causal factors that we can safely assume for now. You've probably already thought of the first, that which points to a more global trend in the rise of right-wing populism. I mean, no matter what side of the political fence you are, virtually no one would disagree that the 2016 presidential elections in the United States really marked a sea change in the direction and spirit of democratic politics worldwide. From that point on, notoriously mouthy populists have taken power in surprise electoral victories in countries as disparate as Hungary, the Philippines, as well as Brazil, and we've seen extreme right-wing parties significantly increase their vote share in all of Europe and also parts of Latin America. Now, global trends shape domestic political dynamics in a number of different ways, and it's too complicated to pin any one thing down as a for sure here. But one of the most important factors is the transnational diffusion of ideas, which depends almost entirely on humans' ability to travel and communicate on a global scale. Now, research in this particular field, I would say, is still in its infancy. But I suspect that one of our chief drivers of the global rise in mostly right-wing populism comes from the recent boom worldwide in internet-based social media. By 2020, for example, 2 billion people around the world had a Facebook profile, and 2.5 billion people were using the WhatsApp messaging platform, both of which serve as magnifying vehicles for vibrant international trade in ideas. Often really bad ideas, which are typically couched in simplistic memes that act as bait to catch and tug your subconscious down an endless rabbit hole of self-affirming absurdities. Now, domestically too, social media, as you know, has become the chief platform for the spread of fake news, which according to a recent study is on average 6 times more likely to grab the average person's attention than non-fake news, which tends to be less scandalous, of course. Like, for example, I once caught an old friend of mine sharing an article on Facebook that accused the Obama administration of lining the floors of the White House with Muslim prayer rugs. And of course, the article had already been shared about 100,000 times. Way more times than the article that called it out for being fake news. In any case, the important thing to note here is that social media, while facilitating the rapid spread of ideas and information, also undermined public trust in government all around the world in recent years, and particularly in liberal democracies where the freedom of expression is so thoroughly regarded as the bedrock of sustainable self-rule. And as we know from our previous discussions about populism, this thin-centered ideology, or political logic or style as you would have it, tends to thrive where the public's trust in institutions of government has fallen into sharp decline. It is specifically in these moments where the populist, whether left-wing or right-wing, can best succeed in their implicit claim to physically and spiritually embody the national cause or the nation itself, and push their Manichaean narrative about some virtuous people and their fight against some corrupt elite, always insisting that they, the populist, and only the populist himself, can save the country from certain doom. And so it is that social media has played an important role in generating the conditions in which unlikely leaders like Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro rose to power in the first place. But, of course, there are also more real, tangible reasons behind Bolsonaro's meteoric rise that are very specific to Brazil. Here the list is long, but I'm going to keep it as simple as I can. First, recall that the Brazilian left, the Workers' Party, or the PT as it's known here, came to power in 2002, riding that massive regional wave that some clever person back then dubbed the pink tide. The Workers' Party then held on to national power for all of 14 straight years, creating a situation that for many people in the center or on the right began to feel like was an institutional monopoly on government. Now their frustration started to deepen and spread rapidly after 2013 because of 2 important things. First, while the Workers' Party presided over rapid and sustained economic growth during the first decade of their new millennium, and also during which they dramatically expanded their support base by way of increasing government spending and yada yada. Well, the second decade of this millennium saw a very sharp economic decline and even contraction for several consecutive years here in Brazil. Inflation increased, jobs were lost, and naturally their support base began to wobble. Now, and then came the atomic bomb of political scandals, the so-called Lava Jato, or the car wash. In March of 2014, Brazil's federal police began unraveling what in time would become known as the biggest money laundering scheme in Brazilian history, wherein over the course of just a few years, an estimated $10 billion in public money would be siphoned into the pockets of Brazil's political leadership and economic elites. That's a lot of money. And just about everybody in government was in on the scheme, including dozens of members of Congress. And whether the president at the time, Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party, was in on it too, that was immaterial. Since the buck stops at the presidency, she found herself right in the middle of the firing line, and in August of 2016, she was impeached. The next year, her predecessor, the wildly popular former President Lula, was jailed on corruption charges and banned from running again for president, despite the fact that he probably would have won if he were able to run. Now, it was in this atmosphere that the various social media platforms in Brazil, namely Facebook and WhatsApp, became the launching pad for a massive campaign of fake and misleading news about the outgoing Workers' Party, their supposed allies in the mainstream media, and even the core institutions of the state itself. Now, it started like it was some kind of joke. I kind of remember this back in the day. Bloggers accused the Ministry of Education of trying to destroy human reproduction in Brazil by using public schools as a vehicle to promote homosexuality. Then you got supposedly leaked documents that proved the Workers' Party was in fact trying to turn Brazil into a communist country. And then you had this disarmament program that people thought was a way to prevent some type of counter-revolution in the process. And many others also claimed that the left in general had invented the concept of human rights as a sort of scam in order to protect criminal enterprise from the justice system so that they themselves could tax the profits of crime. So much of this onslaught of social media-based information seemed outlandish and sketchy, if not totally comical. But over time, millions of people began to deeply embrace this narrative that the government of the left, in cahoots with any number of opportunistic career politicians of any stripe, was thoroughly bent on destroying the last vestiges of freedom, honor, and generally capitalism in Brazil. Pretty soon they believed that the left was going to turn Brazil into Cuba or Venezuela, some socialist economic catastrophe of epic proportions, or perhaps even the Soviet Union, replete with its gulags and mass deportations and the utter squashing of the human soul. Well, in the last 2 or 3 months before the 2018 elections, this narrative swept over Brazil like a hurricane. Seemingly overnight, entire communities awoke into some weird kind of hyper-political awareness. Often for the first time in their lives, they now saw themselves as heroic agents of national salvation. They put on their colors, they took to the streets, and they chanted Bolsonaro's name. The man who they once laughed at, but who they now believed was the only person capable of saving the Brazil that they knew and loved from some total destruction. And just as importantly, they recorded all of this on social media, and they kept sharing every little meme and blog post that seemed to reaffirm the narrative that drove them out into the streets in the first place. Meanwhile, this onslaught, along with the failing economy, the rising crime rate, and the deepening corruption scandals, all of this caused the Workers' Party and its support base on the left to fracture and to recoil. Now with their most popular leaders either impeached or imprisoned or banned from competing in the elections, the left ended up forwarding a candidate with little name and even less charisma, Fernando Haddad. He was a mayor from São Paulo. He barely stood a chance. On election day, October 28, 2018, Jair Bolsonaro defeated him by nearly 11 percentage points. In political pundit parlance, that's what we call a landslide. So how again can we explain the rise of Jair Bolsonaro and other such right-wing populists around the world in recent years? Well, to be sure, there's a lot of causes we could point to, but one of the most compelling is the one that you're holding in your hands right now. I'm Professor Michael Wolff, and this is Latin American Politics Online.
Soy el fuego que arde tu piel, soy el agua que mata tu sed, el castillo, la torre yo soy, la espada que guarda el caudal, tú el aire que respiro yo, y la luz de la luna en el mar, la garganta que ansió morir.